Hi everyone, I'm Alice, and this is Waterfront Wednesdays, brought to you by Boston Harbor Now. Today, I'm on Long Wharf with Lamerty Frazier, an artist and the Director of Education at the Museum of African American History of Boston and Nantucket.
Hi, Alice. I'm very happy to be here.
Lamerty, I'm really excited to talk to you today about a few things, about the intersection of land and water, about the connections and intertwined histories of the indigenous people of Massachusetts and the African American people who were brought here, as well as the potential stories that we can pull from ships and the water and the way that they offer both confinement and a sense of freedom.
Yes, well, I want to begin with saying that our story is in the land, and we want to acknowledge the presence of the Massachusetts nation who owned the land, and we are its guests. As a result of this land being acquired, as we can even look at some of the references of Thomas Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia, when the native people were being divested and dispossessed of their lands, there is the arrival of the Africans. And the moment that we share here in Boston is after the landing of, in 1620, of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, the Puritans that have been conveyed on the water. We look at subsequent events that are happening, and one of them is 1638 and the arrival of the Desire, which has taken from the Caribbean native Africans who have been exchanged for native people and brought here to Boston's harbor.
So the Desire transports both indigenous people from here away,
yes,
and brings African people to these shores.
Yes, and so these kidnapped Africans begin the first documented history of Africans and indigenous people having this intersectionality, if you will, and a shared history of over 400 years that is about resistance, is about sovereignty, is about freedom, if you will, and the relationship of land and water.
And these points of intersection, they happen continuously throughout the 1630s. The English colonists arrive, they begin trading, there's records of this in the paper.
Yes, yes. We find that there are ads immediately in the papers, as the moment of 1638 also brings the first printing press to Cambridge on the John from England. There is this moment of being able to publish. And so these newspapers that are carrying ads about the availability of Africans who can be purchased for their labor is very prevalent. There are points to Long Wharf, actually, where the days that they can come and how many are coming in and who to look to and what company is supporting this sale. So we have a documented history that has not been necessarily vetted in our history books the way that it would make sense to us. And so looking at this lens of history from the water and that aspect of the relationship that Africans and indigenous people have to that water, it is important to understand that on land there are more restrictive qualities that are presented in the life than there would be on the sea. And the fact that interdependency on the sea to survive on all of that water is important. So when we look at what is being labeled as blackjacks and the African experience on the water, we're looking at men who are learning skills, who are using some of what they have brought with them as they are from coastal waters. The 8 forts that have been set up along the African Gold Coast in the 1500s is actually built to enslave Africans and bring them across the waters to the Western Hemisphere. And so when they come here, those skills are then actually acute and critical to their survival here.
So there's a point of intersection where we know that there are these printing presses, there are these people who are brought here, we have the record of their arrival, we don't always know where they go next, but there's one person who's brought in the 1750s, a young girl on a ship called the Phyllis, And her story is going to be really important to the printing press. So I'll let you share it.
The Wheatleys are in Boston. They're an affluent family, and there is this ad run that there will be the arrival of Negroes for sale. They are desirous of a servant girl. So they go to the Boston Harbor, and they see this young girl who is from the Senegambia region, who is between the ages of 6 and 7 years old. And as the Wheatleys purchase her, they name her after the ship that she's arrived on, the Phyllis, and she becomes Phyllis Wheatley. She is educated with the Wheatley's daughter. She is very proficient in English and begins to write poetry, and is writing her first published poem by the age of 12. So this begins the career of a woman that we begin to know in literary history by means of her own acumen and her own capacity to have learned English and to be able to express it in ways that have been phenomenal. And so when visitors come to the home, it is often that she recites her poetry, and one of the businessmen takes this message back to England with him to inform the Duchess in England that this person who is very young and very African can recite and write poetry. So the Duchess says that as long as they can prove that she has written this, that she would publish the manuscript. And she is then quizzed by 18 white men scholars, one of them the governor of Massachusetts, some of them from Harvard, and she passes with flying colors, and she and her manuscript head for England, where it is published in 1773.
A boat trip by choice.
A boat trip by choice. So that water is responsible for what we call one of the first literary marks for African American literature. What is important about her volume is that it not only announces the literature of the African American canon, but it also is visual production, because her book has a frontispiece with her image that is done by an enslaved African who lives next door to her, Scipio Moorhead. So with the emergence of that volume, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, in 1773, we have the beginning of an African American literary and visual art canon.
Wow. And Phyllis, you know, she's going there in 1773 to England. She's right on the cusp of the American Revolution, and she's a contemporary of this other man who really in many ways also marks the start of the American Revolution. He is someone, some people, if you don't live in Boston, you might think that the Declaration of Independence is the kickoff of the American Revolution, or the Battle of Lexington Concord, the Tea Party even, but I think many Bostonians really point to March of 1770 and the Boston Massacre. But I'll let you start the story earlier.
Yes, I think resistance is a mark for those who are enslaved, and they began that resistance immediately. When we look at Crispus Attucks, we would find an ad in 1750 where he is running away from his enslaver in Framingham, and he is described as a 6'2" mulatto, very well spoken, and that is 20 years before the Boston Massacre. He runs to Nantucket, where his Wampanoag Native American mother is from. He is the product of his father being an Ashanti from Ghana, and he decides to be a whaler. He learns the skill of whaling and is on the sea for 20 years prior to the happening on March 5th, 1770 of the Boston Massacre. In fact, he is here in that moment, awaiting passage to North Carolina on another ship that would have been leaving Boston's harbor. Instead, he gets involved in the melee. He is about understanding what independence means. He has been on the water and he's been free, relatively free. There's a relationship between slavery, freedom, and who's in possession of what as we negotiate the water. But Crispus is important in this story of another intersection of Black and Indigenous people who are about securing their own sovereignty and freedom. And it is no surprise then that Crispus is involved in this melee for the independence of what has been the milieu of freedom from Britain as he negotiates and is in this melee with other colonists. So.
And shortly after that, there are other African men who make the choice to both be part of the American Revolution, and their freedom and their success just expands after that. The Cuffey brothers, right?
Yes. John and Paul Cuffey are born in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. They're born free people. And their mother was native indigenous, and their father also Ashanti, like Crispus. They grow up, they're educated, they are taught shipbuilding and boat building by their uncle, who is their mother's brother. And consequently, they are very, very skilled people on the water. They run as blockade runners to bring supplies and goods to the people who are on Nantucket during the American Revolution. So they are skillful and strategic about how they participate on the water, and eventually they have their own fleet of ships. We have Paul Cuffey, who is manning the first voyages to go back to Africa in 1815 and setting up an economic base. In fact, there are 5 families from the free Black community in Boston that go with him on that voyage because they want a different kind of life. There was a focus of the Back to Africa movement as Blacks were not treated fairly here, and setting up a life of survival elsewhere. So one of the points of expatriation was to go back to Africa. And along with that, there were also negotiations between here and Haiti for securing a life that was free.
Yeah. These are really incredible stories, and I think you've done a great job in your research and in your storytelling and in your art of conveying that there are both the named stories and then there's the unnamed stories that we need to be aware of. And one way that will be commemorated here in the future is that you're working on a new marker on Long Wharf.
Oh yes, we call the Middle Passage marker, and it is along with the other markers that have been posed in Boston that span from the State House to the wharf, called Walk to the Sea. This particular marker will be identified as coming in from the sea. It is to mark the 1638 arrival of the Africans, first documented Africans here in Boston's harbor. And the line from that point to a spot at State Street that's marked now, that used to be King Street, where the Boston Massacre occurred and Crispus Attucks' death. When we talk about this marker, we want people to be able to engage that not only did that history begin in 1638, but the free Black community began to emerge by 1798 and purchased the land between Myrtle and Cambridge Street on Joy Street to build the African Meeting House and to begin a space that they could gather in for church, education, and the end of slavery. It is a spot of the Underground Railroad. It is a very viable point in Boston that is connected to the harbor, because many of the people who were involved in that community had been people who were on the sea, who had been mariners, who negotiated and traded in mercantile arithmetic and learned it for that purpose. So this is a very rich history that we have in relationship to the land and the water here in Boston.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Okay.
Thank you all for tuning in. I'm Alice Brown. This is Lamerche Frazier. You can go to the African American Meeting House today. That is the museum where Lamerche works. You can visit them online at maah.org or Twitter at maahmuseum. You can always follow me on Twitter at fairyfairy. And if you like this video, please tell your friends, share it further, give us a like, and follow us for more Waterfront Wednesday vlog material. We'll see you on the waterfront.
Yes.